Love destroys empires. Ethan Blackwood once told a room full of reporters beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Manhattan Business Forum, and the sentence traveled across headlines, podcasts, and late-night television like a warning carved into steel, because when Ethan Blackwood spoke, the financial world listened. At 36 years old, he had built Blackwood Global into a $40 billion empire that stretched from New York to Singapore, a man whose penthouse overlooked Central Park from 80 stories above the city, where the skyline glittered each night like a field of diamonds and the silence felt almost sacred. People called him brilliant, ruthless, disciplined, a man who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions the way others ordered coffee, calm voice, steady eyes, never rushed, never emotional. But those who worked closest to him knew something else as well, a quiet rule he had lived by for almost a decade, a rule that had shaped every decision, every relationship, every carefully measured step of his life. Ethan Blackwood did not believe in love. The story behind that rule was rarely spoken aloud, but it lived inside the controlled rhythm of his life, in the way his penthouse held no photographs, in the way his calendar allowed room only for board meetings, investor calls, and strategy sessions, never anniversaries, never holidays, never anything that required the unpredictable gravity of human attachment. On a cold November evening, the city below him pulsed with the restless energy of Manhattan traffic while Ethan stood near the glass wall of his office, one hand resting lightly on a crystal tumbler of sparkling water, not whiskey, never whiskey during business hours, as Marcus Reed, his longtime attorney and the only man who spoke to him without hesitation, placed a thin leather folder on the polished desk. The folder contained a problem, and in Ethan's world problems were solved with strategy, not emotion. Marcus cleared his throat and spoke carefully, because even after 10 years he understood the delicate architecture of the man standing before him. The board is concerned about succession stability, he said quietly. The bylaws your father wrote require the CEO of Blackwood Global to be married to maintain majority control. Ethan didn't turn from the window at first, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes like distant stars. Then he spoke with the same calm tone he used during billion-dollar negotiations. How inconvenient. Marcus hesitated before adding the next line. The shareholders believe a public marriage would stabilize the company during the upcoming acquisition season. Silence followed, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the glass walls of the office. But Ethan Blackwood did not look angry. He rarely did. Instead, he simply lifted the tumbler, took a measured sip, and set it down again with quiet precision. A marriage, he said finally, as if testing the weight of the word. Marcus nodded. A contractual arrangement would satisfy the legal requirement without complications. Ethan almost smiled at that word. Complications, the polite language of boardrooms hiding the chaos of human emotion, the very chaos he had eliminated from his life years ago. Somewhere far below, sirens echoed through the Manhattan streets while a helicopter drifted slowly across the winter sky, its red lights blinking like a distant signal. Ethan watched it for a moment and then turned toward his desk, expression calm, calculating, the same look that had terrified competitors for years. If the company requires a wife, he said evenly, then we will find one. But understand this, Marcus, his voice lowered slightly, still controlled, still steady. This will not involve love. Marcus gave a small nod, already expecting that answer, and began outlining the legal framework for a contract marriage while Ethan listened with the focus of a man studying market data. Somewhere across the same city, in a quiet neighborhood far from Wall Street towers, a woman named Amara Bennett was finishing a long day at a community learning center where children's drawings covered the walls in bright crayon colors, her laughter warm, her presence steady, a woman who believed love could rebuild broken places. A belief so different from Ethan Blackwood's that the universe itself seemed to be preparing a collision neither of them could yet imagine. Because the man who had sworn that love destroys empires was about to meet the one woman who would make him question everything he thought he knew about strength, loyalty, and the promises a heart can break. Morning sunlight slid between the towers of Manhattan like liquid gold, reflecting off the glass walls of Blackwood Global headquarters where the top floor belonged entirely to Ethan Blackwood, a space so quiet and meticulously ordered that even the air seemed to respect his discipline. At 7:30 sharp, he walked through the executive corridor wearing a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it moved with him like armor, his stride steady, his attention already focused on the numbers glowing across the tablet in his hand, quarterly forecasts, acquisition projections, investment flows measured down to the last decimal, the language of control that had built his empire one calculated decision at a time. Employees stepped aside instinctively as he passed, because Ethan Blackwood carried a presence that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only certainty, the kind of certainty that made billion-dollar negotiations feel inevitable rather than risky. Inside the boardroom, Marcus Reed waited beside a long walnut conference table where a digital display showed the company charter written decades earlier by Ethan's father, a man who had believed strongly in legacy, tradition, and the stability of family, values that Ethan respected in theory but rarely practiced in his own life. Marcus adjusted his glasses and gestured toward the highlighted clause on the screen, which stated clearly that the chief executive officer must be legally married in order to maintain permanent voting authority over the corporation, a rule that had once seemed ceremonial but now stood between Ethan and the absolute control required for the upcoming global merger. Ethan studied the text without emotion, his expression as calm as the skyline outside the windows stretching across 50 miles of winter blue sky. The board will vote in 2 months. Marcus explained quietly, investors prefer the image of stability and continuity. A married chief executive sends that signal. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled together, considering the problem the way a chess player studies the middle game of a complex match. Marriage, he said at last, as though evaluating a business instrument rather than a personal commitment. Marcus nodded once. A contractual arrangement would meet the legal requirement without emotional entanglement. The agreement can define boundaries, duration, financial terms, public appearances, everything controlled. Ethan's gaze shifted toward the distant line of Central Park, where bare winter trees traced thin shadows across the snow. Control had always been the foundation of his success. Control over markets, control over negotiations, control over his own life. Emotions complicated decisions, and complications destroyed efficiency. Then we approach it like any other partnership, he said. Finally, structured, transparent, temporary. Marcus opened a thin folder containing preliminary notes from the legal department. Several candidates had already been screened discreetly. Women with strong professional reputations, clean public records, and no direct connection to rival corporations. Ethan listened only partially because his mind had already moved ahead, calculating headlines, investor reactions, media strategy. A public marriage would satisfy the board, stabilize stock confidence, and remove the final obstacle standing between Blackwood Global and the largest acquisition in its history. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Manhattan, far from the polished glass towers of the financial district, the morning unfolded differently inside a modest brick building where children's voices echoed down brightly painted hallways. Amara Bennett knelt beside a small desk, helping a 10-year-old boy carefully finish a reading assignment, while winter sunlight filtered through tall classroom windows and landed softly on the colorful drawings taped across the walls. The Learning Center operated on a tight budget supported mostly by donations and volunteer hours, yet the warmth inside the room felt richer than any marble lobby on Park Avenue. Amara moved from desk to desk with calm patience, encouraging each child with the steady confidence that had become her signature, because she believed deeply that kindness could reshape futures that statistics had already tried to limit. By late morning, she stepped into the tiny office at the back of the center where stacks of paperwork waited beside a worn coffee mug and a framed photograph of the first group of children who had ever enrolled in the program 5 years earlier. Her phone buzzed gently across the desk, interrupting the quiet rhythm of the day. The number unfamiliar, but the area code unmistakably Manhattan corporate. Amara hesitated for a moment before answering, unaware that a decision being finalized high above the city in a glass boardroom was quietly moving both of their lives toward the same unexpected intersection. The unfamiliar number remained on Amara Bennett's phone screen for a moment before she answered, her voice calm but curious as she stepped closer to the narrow window of the office where the winter sun reflected softly off the rooftops of Harlem. And on the other end, a professional voice introduced himself as Daniel Foster from Blackwood Global Corporate Outreach Division. the tone polished and careful in the way large companies train their representatives to sound both friendly and authoritative at the same time. Amara listened quietly while the man explained that Blackwood Global was reviewing several community programs for potential strategic partnerships and that her learning center had been recommended by a regional education consultant who had recently visited the facility, a recommendation that had apparently moved her organization into the final stage of a corporate grant review. The news caught Amara by surprise because the center had applied for dozens of grants over the past 2 years, and most responses had been polite rejections or long silences that never ended in funding. Daniel continued speaking with the same measured confidence, explaining that the final review process required a short in-person presentation before a corporate panel at Blackwood Global headquarters later that week, a meeting that would allow selected nonprofit leaders to present their mission, financial needs, and long-term vision. Amara glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall, where volunteer schedules and tutoring sessions filled nearly every square. The small center running on careful planning and determination rather than large budgets. The idea of presenting their work inside a corporate skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan felt almost surreal. Yet the opportunity could mean enough funding to keep the center open for several more years. She thanked Daniel sincerely and wrote down the appointment details while he explained the time, the security procedures, and the building address located just a few blocks from Central Park. After the call ended, Amara remained standing beside the window for several seconds, letting the possibility settle into her thoughts. Then she smiled quietly to herself because hope had always been the quiet engine behind every challenge she faced. Across the city in the glass tower of Blackwood Global, the rhythm of corporate decision-making continued with the steady precision that defined Ethan Blackwood's leadership style. And by late afternoon, Marcus Reed returned to the executive office carrying a folder containing the first official list of potential candidates who might enter into the carefully designed marriage contract. The profiles were concise, organized with the same attention to detail that guided every strategic decision inside the company. Each candidate possessing professional credentials, stable public reputations, and personal backgrounds that would withstand the intense scrutiny of financial media and corporate analysts. Ethan studied the documents without visible emotion while the skyline slowly shifted from pale winter daylight to the amber glow of evening city lights. One candidate was a corporate attorney with experience in international trade law. Another was a venture capital consultant known for her disciplined financial insight. And a third profile described a public relations executive whose expertise in media strategy had attracted national recognition. Marcus explained the practical advantages of each option, outlining how the arrangement could be structured to last exactly 2 years, which would be sufficient time to secure the board's long-term confidence, while also protecting both parties through clearly defined legal boundaries. Ethan listened with quiet concentration, but after several minutes, he closed the folder gently and rested his hand on the desk as though the solution remained incomplete. Something about the entire exercise felt predictable, almost mechanical, as if he were selecting a new board member rather than entering a partnership that the public would interpret as marriage. Outside the glass wall, the lights of Manhattan shimmered against the darkening sky, and the distant sound of evening traffic drifted upward like a soft echo of the city's restless energy. Marcus noticed the hesitation and asked calmly if there was a concern with the candidates. Ethan considered the question before answering with the same thoughtful precision that guided every major decision in his life. Competence is not the issue, he said quietly. Predictability is. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, while Ethan continued in a reflective tone. The board expects a public image that feels authentic, not something that appears engineered by attorneys. Marcus understood immediately that the success of the arrangement depended not only on legal structure, but also on public perception. Investors trusted narratives that felt real. At that exact moment, several miles north in the modest learning center, Amara Bennett locked the classroom door after the final tutoring session of the evening, unaware that a chain of carefully calculated corporate decisions and a single unexpected phone call were slowly guiding her toward a meeting that would place her face to face with the man who believed love was the most dangerous risk any powerful person could take. 2 days later, the winter morning sky above Manhattan stretched wide and pale blue as Amara Bennett stepped out of the subway station on 57th Street. the cold air brushing against her face, while the towering glass buildings around her reflected the early sunlight like polished mirrors. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her modest leather bag, and looked up at the skyline that seemed to rise endlessly toward the clouds, because somewhere among those towers stood the headquarters of Blackwood Global, the company that might decide whether the small learning center she had built with years of effort would survive or quietly disappear. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, while black town cars and yellow taxis slid past in a constant rhythm that felt very different from the quiet streets around her neighborhood school. Yet Amara carried herself with the calm confidence that came from years of guiding children through difficult beginnings. When she finally reached the entrance of the Blackwood Global building, the structure rose nearly 80 stories above the street, its glass facade reflecting Central Park only a few blocks away like a green ribbon cutting through the city. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere felt polished and precise, marble floors shining beneath soft white lighting, while a tall sculpture of brushed steel curved upward toward the ceiling like a frozen wave. Security officers greeted visitors with professional courtesy as digital screens displayed market updates and global financial headlines scrolling across the walls. Amara presented her identification and the appointment confirmation email she had printed the night before, and within minutes a receptionist directed her toward a private elevator reserved for executive meetings. As the elevator doors closed, she felt the gentle upward motion lifting her through the building floor by floor until the digital panel displayed the number 62. The doors opened onto a quiet reception area where the city skyline spread across enormous windows like a moving painting of steel and sunlight. A young assistant welcomed her with a warm but professional smile and offered coffee while explaining that the presentation panel would begin shortly. Amara thanked her and walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking Central Park, where early joggers traced tiny paths through the winter trees far below. Meanwhile, inside a nearby office, Ethan Blackwood stood beside his desk reviewing the final briefing notes for the day's scheduled meetings, the morning sunlight stretching across the polished surface of the conference table, while Marcus Reed summarized the agenda in his steady voice. The community partnership presentations are scheduled for 10:30, Marcus explained. The outreach division selected 3 organizations for final review, and the Learning Center from Harlem is among them. Ethan glanced briefly at the document, but his expression remained composed. These meetings were routine evaluations for the corporate social responsibility division, yet Marcus had insisted that his presence would signal strong executive support for the program. Ethan agreed, not out of personal interest, but because reputation management had always been an essential part of maintaining investor confidence. 10 minutes later, he entered the conference room, where a long table faced a large presentation screen, and several executives from the outreach department were already seated reviewing their notes. The room grew quiet as Amara Bennett stepped through the doorway guided by the assistant. Her posture calm, though the scale of the room and the view of Manhattan stretching beyond the windows could easily intimidate someone unfamiliar with corporate spaces. Ethan looked up from the tablet in front of him, and for the first time his attention paused on something that had nothing to do with financial projections or acquisition strategies. Amara greeted the panel with a clear and steady voice before connecting her laptop to the screen. And as the presentation began, photographs of the Learning Center appeared across the display, showing classrooms filled with bright drawings, shelves of donated books, and smiling children holding reading certificates. She spoke not with rehearsed corporate language, but with quiet conviction, describing the center's mission to provide tutoring, mentorship, and safe after-school programs for students whose families often worked multiple jobs. Her words carried the kind of sincerity that rarely appeared inside boardrooms where conversations usually revolved around market forecasts and shareholder expectations. Ethan listened without interruption while the executives around him nodded thoughtfully. Yet something about the calm determination in her voice and the simple clarity of her purpose drew his focus in a way he did not fully understand. When the presentation ended, the room remained silent for a brief moment before questions began from the panel about funding models and expansion plans, and as Amara answered each one with careful honesty, Ethan realized that the unpredictability he had mentioned to Marcus only days earlier had just entered the room in the form of a woman who believed the world could change through patience, compassion, and unwavering belief in possibility. The conference room remained quiet for a moment after the final slide faded from the screen, the photograph of children holding brightly colored reading certificates lingering in the minds of the executives seated around the long table, while the winter light of Manhattan poured through the towering windows behind them. Amara Bennett stood calmly beside the presentation screen, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the laptop as she waited for the panel to respond, not with the nervousness of someone seeking approval, but with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that meaningful work rarely depended on applause. One of the outreach directors cleared his throat first and began asking questions about funding structures and volunteer management. And Amara answered each inquiry with thoughtful clarity, explaining how the Learning Center had grown from a single after-school classroom into a community hub supporting more than 80 students each week. The program built not on large grants, but on consistent effort from teachers, parents, and volunteers who believed education could reshape a future that statistics often predicted too quickly. Ethan Blackwood listened without interrupting, his attention unusually focused on the calm confidence in her voice rather than the numbers appearing in the financial projections displayed on the screen. Normally, he evaluated presentations the way an engineer analyzes structural blueprints, searching for weaknesses, risks, inefficiencies. Yet as Amara spoke, he noticed something different from the calculated language of corporate meetings, a kind of sincerity that carried weight without demanding recognition. When one executive asked how she managed to maintain optimism despite limited resources, Amara paused briefly before answering with a gentle smile that seemed both practical and deeply certain. Because children do not measure their potential by the size of a budget, she said quietly. They measure it by the number of adults who believe they can succeed. The words lingered in the room like a soft echo, and Ethan found himself studying her more carefully now, noticing the steadiness in the way she spoke and the thoughtful pauses between her sentences, as though every statement was chosen with care rather than performance. After several more questions, the outreach director thanked her for the presentation and explained that the panel would review the proposals before announcing the selected partnership later that afternoon. Amara gathered her laptop and notes with the same composed efficiency she had shown throughout the meeting, offering a warm nod of appreciation before turning toward the door. As she stepped into the quiet reception area outside the conference room, she allowed herself a slow breath, the tension of the moment finally easing while she gazed once more through the enormous window overlooking Central Park, where the pale winter sunlight stretched across the frozen paths like silver threads. Inside the conference room, Marcus Reed closed the folder containing the candidate profiles that still rested on the side of the table from the earlier discussion about the contractual marriage arrangement. And as the executives began speaking about the nonprofit proposals, Marcus noticed that Ethan remained unusually silent. Normally, Ethan guided conversations with precise efficiency, yet now he appeared thoughtful in a way that Marcus had rarely seen during purely corporate discussions. Finally, Ethan spoke with the same calm tone he used during negotiations, but his words were directed not at the financial projections, but at the presentation they had just witnessed. Authenticity matters in public perception, he said quietly. Investors trust narratives that feel genuine rather than manufactured. Marcus recognized the subtle connection immediately because Ethan had used almost the same words earlier that week when discussing the challenge of finding a partner for the carefully structured marriage contract. The outreach director confirmed that the Learning Center met several criteria for long-term partnership potential and that additional meetings with the organization's leadership might be necessary before final approval. Ethan gave a small nod while glancing once toward the door through which Amara had just left the room, an unusual flicker of curiosity crossing his otherwise composed expression. Across the reception area, Amara Bennett was already preparing to leave the building, unaware that the quiet impression she had left inside the conference room had begun to shift the direction of two separate decisions unfolding within the same tower, one involving a corporate grant that could transform her learning center, and the other involving a contract marriage that Ethan Blackwood believed would remain entirely untouched by emotion, a belief that the calm woman who had just walked through his office floor might soon challenge in ways he could not yet anticipate. By late afternoon, the winter sun had shifted across the glass walls of Blackwood Global, painting long amber reflections across the executive floor, while the city below continued its restless movement of taxis, office workers, and distant traffic lights blinking like signals across Manhattan. Inside the conference room, the outreach committee had already moved on to the next proposal. Yet Ethan Blackwood remained quietly attentive to the notes on the tablet in front of him, where a brief summary of Amara Bennett's Learning Center still glowed on the screen. The numbers themselves were modest compared to the scale of investments his company normally reviewed, but the clarity of the mission described in the report carried a weight that lingered in his thoughts longer than expected. Marcus Reed noticed the pause and leaned slightly closer as the meeting concluded, his voice low and practical as always. The outreach team will finalize their recommendation by tomorrow morning. If the Learning Center is approved, the grant could cover several years of operational support. Ethan nodded once, closing the tablet with measured calm before standing near the tall windows overlooking Central Park, where the late afternoon lights stretched across the frozen paths like silver threads. Normally, his attention returned immediately to the next strategic priority. Yet today a quiet curiosity followed him as he considered the woman who had presented her work with such composed certainty. She had spoken about hope the way financial analysts spoke about profit margins, not as an abstract concept but as a practical investment in the future. Marcus waited beside the desk holding the thin leather folder that still contained the profiles of potential candidates for the contractual marriage arrangement, a solution that had seemed straightforward only days earlier. Ethan took the folder and opened it again slowly, scanning the names and credentials that described women with impressive careers and carefully managed public reputations. Each profile satisfied the requirements of stability, intelligence, and discretion. Yet as he reviewed the pages, he found himself thinking about something Marcus had said during their earlier discussion, that public perception mattered as much as legal structure. A marriage designed purely by attorneys might protect the company on paper, but it could also appear artificial under the scrutiny of investors and journalists who studied every decision made by Blackwood Global. Ethan closed the folder gently and set it aside on the desk. Authenticity creates stronger confidence, he said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus, who watched him with thoughtful attention. Across the city, Amara Bennett stepped back onto the busy sidewalk outside the towering building, the winter air sharp against her cheeks while the sound of traffic rolled through the streets like a constant river of motion. She paused for a moment beside the entrance, looking up once more at the glass facade that stretched high above her, still absorbing the surreal experience of presenting the work she loved inside a room filled with executives whose decisions could shape the future of entire industries. Yet her thoughts quickly returned to the children waiting at the Learning Center and the tutoring schedule she had promised to prepare before evening classes began. She walked toward the subway station with steady determination, unaware that her calm voice and unwavering belief in possibility had unsettled the expectations of one of the most controlled men in Manhattan. Back inside the tower, Ethan Blackwood returned to his office where the skyline slowly darkened as evening approached, the first lights of the city flickering on one by one across the horizon. He stood beside the glass wall with his hands resting lightly against the polished edge of the desk, while Marcus reviewed the next item on the schedule, a private reception later that week hosted by a philanthropic foundation that often collaborated with corporate donors. Several nonprofit leaders from the outreach program will attend, Marcus explained, including the director of the Harlem Learning Center if their proposal advances to the final stage. Ethan listened quietly before giving a small nod of acknowledgement, the idea settling into place with the same calm precision he used when planning business negotiations. Because somewhere between the logic of corporate strategy and the unexpected sincerity of a woman who believed that hope could reshape a future, a subtle shift had begun inside the carefully ordered world Ethan Blackwood had built, a shift that would soon place them in the same room again under circumstances neither of them yet fully understood. 3 days later, the evening air over Manhattan carried the crisp calm of early winter, while soft golden lights illuminated the grand ballroom of the Emerson Philanthropy Foundation, an annual reception where corporate leaders and nonprofit directors gathered beneath towering crystal chandeliers to discuss education initiatives and community investment. The room glowed with quiet elegance as waiters moved between small groups offering sparkling water and coffee, while conversations blended into a low hum of polite introductions and thoughtful exchanges. Ethan Blackwood entered through the tall double doors with the composed confidence that had become his signature presence in rooms like this, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored and his expression steady as he greeted several board members with brief nods of recognition. Events like this were not unusual in his world. Philanthropy often intersected with corporate strategy. Yet tonight his attention moved through the room with a subtle focus that Marcus Reed noticed immediately. Across the ballroom, Amara Bennett stood near a long window overlooking Fifth Avenue, where the headlights of evening traffic streamed through the city like silver ribbons, her hands resting lightly around a glass of sparkling water as she listened to a foundation coordinator explain how the Grant Review Committee had been deeply impressed with the work of the Harlem Learning Center. The conversation felt surreal because only days earlier she had walked into the Blackwood Global building hoping simply for a chance to speak about the children she worked with every afternoon, and now she stood among donors and executives whose resources could transform that small center into something far larger than she had ever imagined. When the coordinator finished speaking, Amara thanked her warmly and turned slightly toward the center of the room. And in that quiet moment her eyes met Ethan Blackwood's from across the gathering. Recognition arrived instantly for both of them. Not dramatic or surprising, but calm and unmistakable, like two people realizing they had stepped into the same chapter of a story neither expected to share. Ethan approached with the same composed stride he used during boardroom negotiations, while the soft music of a string quartet drifted through the background. When he reached her, he offered a polite greeting and introduced himself formally, even though they had already been in the same room earlier that week, explaining that he had attended the presentation and wanted to personally thank her for the clarity and sincerity of her work. Amara responded with the steady warmth that had guided her through countless conversations with parents and teachers over the years, telling him she appreciated the opportunity to present the center's mission and that the possibility of partnership meant more to the community than any single grant could express. Their conversation unfolded naturally despite the contrast between their worlds. Ethan speaking with calm precision about long-term educational investment strategies while Amara described the everyday realities of helping children discover confidence through reading and mentorship. As the minutes passed, Marcus watched from a short distance away, recognizing something subtle but important. Because Ethan Blackwood rarely spent extended time in casual conversation unless a negotiation or investment required it. Yet now he listened with genuine attention to stories about tutoring sessions and after-school programs that had nothing to do with market expansion or shareholder reports. Eventually, the foundation coordinator returned to congratulate Amara formally and confirmed that the Harlem Learning Center had been selected for the final partnership stage with Blackwood Global's outreach program. News that brought a quiet smile to Amara's face, while Ethan acknowledged the decision with a thoughtful nod. The evening continued with speeches and introductions, yet a quiet awareness remained between them, an understanding that their brief meeting inside the corporate tower had only been the beginning of something neither had planned. Later, as guests began leaving the ballroom, Ethan stepped toward the tall windows overlooking the city, while Marcus joined him with a curious expression. "You have met many nonprofit directors before," Marcus said quietly. "Yet tonight you seemed particularly interested." Ethan looked out across the glowing skyline before answering in the same calm voice that guided every major decision he made. "Authenticity is rare in rooms like this," he replied simply, "and sometimes rare things deserve closer attention." Across the ballroom, Amara Bennett gathered her coat and prepared to return to the quiet neighborhood where the Learning Center would open again the next morning. Unaware that the controlled world of Ethan Blackwood had just shifted one careful step closer to the unpredictable possibility he had spent years determined to avoid. The following morning, Manhattan awakened beneath a pale silver sky, while early commuters moved through the city with quiet determination, subway doors opening and closing in steady rhythm as the streets filled with the soft roar of buses and taxis, beginning another workday. Inside the Harlem Learning Center, the atmosphere felt warm and alive as children gathered around small desks covered with reading worksheets and brightly colored pencils, their laughter echoing through the modest classrooms. While Amara Bennett moved between them with calm patience, offering encouragement and gentle guidance. The news from the Emerson Philanthropy Foundation had spread quickly among the volunteers and teachers who helped run the center, yet Amara kept the morning routine steady, because she understood that the real purpose of their work remained the same whether a grant arrived or not. A young student named Carlos proudly held up a page filled with carefully written sentences, and Amara knelt beside him with a warm smile, praising the progress he had made since the beginning of the semester. Moments like this reminding her why the long hours and constant uncertainty were always worth the effort. Across the city, in the quiet upper floors of Blackwood Global, Ethan Blackwood stood near the tall windows of his office reviewing the morning market reports, while sunlight slowly illuminated the skyline beyond Central Park. The previous evening's foundation reception had returned to his thoughts more than he expected, not as a distraction, but as a quiet question about the balance between strategy and sincerity that guided his decisions. Marcus Reed entered the office carrying 2 folders, one containing the final outreach recommendation confirming that the Harlem Learning Center would receive long-term funding support, and the other holding the updated list of candidates for the contractual marriage arrangement required by the company bylaws. Ethan listened as Marcus summarized the outreach decision first, explaining that the Foundation and Corporate Outreach Board had unanimously approved the partnership because of the center's measurable impact and clear leadership. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the decision before shifting his attention toward the second folder resting on the desk. Marcus opened it carefully, revealing the same polished profiles that had been reviewed earlier in the week, each candidate meeting every legal and reputational requirement needed to stabilize the company's leadership structure. Yet as Marcus described the advantages of each option, Ethan remained thoughtful, his gaze moving briefly toward the skyline before returning to the folder. Perception influences confidence, he said quietly after a moment, and confidence shapes the market. Marcus understood the meaning behind the statement because Ethan had built his entire career on recognizing how public narratives influenced financial stability. A marriage chosen purely through legal convenience might satisfy the technical requirements, but it could still appear artificial under scrutiny from analysts and investors who watched every move of Blackwood Global. Authenticity strengthens credibility, Ethan continued with calm precision, and credibility protects the company. Marcus paused, thoughtfully recognizing that Ethan was not rejecting the contract strategy, but reconsidering how it might be presented to the world. At that same moment, Amara Bennett stepped outside the Learning Center carrying a small stack of paperwork related to the partnership agreement that the outreach department had emailed earlier that morning, the winter air crisp as she began walking toward the neighborhood cafe where she often reviewed administrative documents between tutoring sessions. The news of the grant still felt almost unreal because it meant the center could expand its reading program and hire additional teachers for the coming year, a possibility she had hoped for but never fully expected. As she reached the corner, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the city streets, and Amara paused for a moment, watching the light reflect off distant buildings while thinking about the conversation she had shared with Ethan Blackwood the previous evening. He had spoken with the calm discipline of a man accustomed to solving enormous problems, yet there had been a quiet curiosity in his questions that she had not anticipated. Back in the executive tower, Ethan closed the candidate folder and looked toward Marcus with a composed expression that signaled a decision forming in his mind. Sometimes the strongest partnerships begin where expectations are not predetermined, he said thoughtfully. Marcus did not answer immediately, but he understood that the unpredictable element Ethan had mentioned days earlier had already entered the equation in the form of a woman whose sincerity had shifted the direction of 2 separate decisions, one involving the future of a community learning center and the other involving a marriage arrangement that had been designed to remain entirely free of emotion until the moment reality began to challenge that assumption. The following afternoon, the sky above Manhattan carried a thin veil of winter clouds while the steady rhythm of the city moved forward without pause. Yet inside the glass tower of Blackwood Global, a decision was quietly taking shape that had nothing to do with stock markets or international mergers. Ethan Blackwood sat behind the wide mahogany desk in his office, studying the skyline that stretched beyond Central Park, while Marcus Reed waited across from him, holding a tablet filled with legal notes regarding the corporate bylaws. For several moments, neither man spoke, because Ethan had always believed that important decisions required silence before they required words. Finally, he leaned forward slightly and rested his hands together on the polished desk. The board requires stability, he said calmly. And stability is not created only by legal contracts, but by narratives people believe. Marcus nodded because the point was clear. Investors trusted authenticity, and authenticity could not be manufactured too obviously. Ethan's gaze moved briefly toward the thin folder that still contained the list of carefully screened candidates for the contract marriage. Women with impeccable credentials who would fit the role perfectly on paper. Yet something about the arrangement continued to feel mechanical, predictable, almost hollow. Marcus waited patiently knowing that Ethan rarely changed direction once a strategy had been formed, yet he also recognized that the past week had introduced a new variable. Ethan spoke again, with the quiet certainty that had guided every major move of his career. Arrange a meeting with Amara Bennett. Marcus blinked once, surprised not by the request itself, but by the calm decisiveness with which it was delivered. You wish to discuss the partnership agreement for the learning center, he asked carefully. Ethan paused for a moment before answering. Partially, he replied, though there may be another matter worth discussing. Marcus did not question the statement further, but he understood immediately that the unpredictable element Ethan had mentioned earlier had now become a deliberate consideration. Across the city, Amara Bennett sat at a small table inside the neighborhood cafe, reviewing the official outreach documents sent by the Blackwood Global Foundation earlier that day. The pages described a funding structure that could support the Learning Center for 5 years, including new classroom materials, expanded tutoring programs, and a mentorship initiative connecting students with volunteers from local universities. The scale of the opportunity felt almost overwhelming because it represented the kind of stability she had hoped to create since the day she first opened the center's doors. Her phone vibrated softly on the table, interrupting her thoughts, and when she answered the call, a polite voice introduced himself as Daniel Foster from the corporate outreach office. He explained that Mr. Blackwood would like to schedule a brief meeting to discuss the future direction of the partnership and to personally hear more about the center's long-term goals. Amara listened with calm curiosity because she had already spoken with Ethan Blackwood during the foundation reception. Yet the idea of meeting him again inside the towering headquarters of his company felt different now that the partnership had been approved. She agreed to the meeting time Daniel proposed for the following afternoon, and after the call ended she remained seated for several seconds watching the late-day sunlight spill across the cafe window while pedestrians passed outside along the busy street. Somewhere deep inside her thoughts, she sensed that the conversation ahead might involve more than simple administrative planning, though she could not yet explain why. The next afternoon, the elevator doors of Blackwood Global opened once again onto the executive floor, where the city skyline stretched wide and bright beneath the winter sky. Amara stepped into the quiet reception area, where the same assistant greeted her warmly, before guiding her toward Ethan Blackwood's private office. When the door opened, Ethan stood near the glass wall overlooking Central Park, the sunlight outlining his tall figure against the distant horizon of Manhattan. He turned with composed calm and greeted her with the same steady presence she remembered from the reception. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Bennett," he said in a voice that carried both professionalism and quiet intention. Amara returned the greeting and took the seat he offered across the desk while the city glowed beyond the windows like a vast living map. For a moment, Ethan studied the documents on the desk before speaking again, his tone thoughtful rather than formal. "Your work at the Learning Center reflects something rare," he said slowly. "Commitment without expectation of recognition," Amara answered with a small smile, explaining that the work mattered more than the attention surrounding it. Ethan nodded as though confirming something he had already considered carefully. Sometimes, he continued, the strongest partnerships begin when two people share a purpose rather than a contract. The sentence hung quietly between them like the first line of a conversation that had not yet revealed its full meaning. And in that silent moment, both of them sensed that the discussion about education funding might soon move into territory neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed inside a conference room high above Manhattan. For several seconds after Ethan Blackwood spoke, the office remained quiet except for the faint hum of the city far below the 82nd floor, the kind of silence that often followed an unexpected statement. Amara Bennett studied him calmly from across the polished desk, while winter sunlight poured through the glass wall behind him, outlining the distant skyline of Manhattan like a living map of steel and glass. She had expected a discussion about educational programs, funding timelines, perhaps even expansion planning. But the tone of Ethan's words suggested that the conversation had moved into unfamiliar territory. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the edge of the desk and continued speaking with the same measured clarity that had built his reputation in boardrooms across the world. Blackwood Global will fully support the Learning Center, he said. The funding agreement has already been approved by the Outreach Committee and will begin next quarter. Amara felt a quiet wave of relief move through her chest because the confirmation meant stability for the students and teachers who depended on the program each day. She thanked him sincerely, yet noticed that his expression suggested the meeting was not finished. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging her gratitude before stepping slowly toward the tall window overlooking Central Park, where the winter trees formed delicate patterns across the frozen paths below. "There is another matter I would like to discuss," he said thoughtfully. Amara waited without interruption because she had learned that meaningful conversations often unfolded best when given space. Ethan turned slightly toward her and spoke with calm precision. "The leadership structure of my company includes an unusual requirement written decades ago by my father. The chief executive officer must be married in order to maintain controlling authority over the board." Amara listened quietly, though the connection between that rule and the present conversation was not yet clear. Ethan continued, explaining that the approaching corporate merger had brought renewed attention to the clause, and that the board expected the requirement to be fulfilled within the coming months. "Normally the solution would be straightforward," he said, "a contractual marriage arranged through legal channels with clearly defined expectations." Amara raised an eyebrow slightly, though her tone remained calm. "You are describing a partnership designed for legal convenience rather than personal connection," she observed. Ethan allowed the faintest hint of a smile, because her interpretation was accurate. "Yes," he replied, "but legal convenience often fails to convince public opinion." Amara considered the statement carefully before responding. "And you believe authenticity would create greater confidence?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Investors trust narratives that feel genuine." The room grew quiet again as the meaning of the conversation began to reveal itself. Amara folded her hands thoughtfully on her lap, while meeting his gaze directly. "You are suggesting that I participate in this arrangement," she said calmly. Ethan did not answer immediately, because he understood the seriousness of the proposal he was about to confirm. Finally, he spoke with the same steady voice that had guided countless negotiations. "I am suggesting that we explore a partnership that could serve both our purposes. The company gains the stability required by the board, while the Learning Center gains long-term support and expansion resources." Amara listened carefully, yet her expression remained composed rather than impressed by the scale of the offer. "You are describing a contract," she replied, "not a marriage." Ethan nodded again, because honesty had always been the foundation of his leadership. "The arrangement would be structured and transparent," he explained. 2 years in duration, with clearly defined boundaries and public appearances when required. Amara looked toward the city beyond the window for a moment, letting the magnitude of the proposal settle into her thoughts. She had spent years building a learning center that depended on determination and community trust, and now she was being asked to consider a decision that could transform both her personal life and the future of the program she cared about most. When she turned back toward Ethan, her voice remained calm though thoughtful. "I would never agree to something that treats people like a business transaction," she said gently. Ethan did not appear offended by the response, but rather quietly attentive. "I respect that," he replied. "The intention is not to diminish the meaning of marriage, but to ensure that neither of us sacrifices our independence while fulfilling responsibilities we both consider important." Another moment of silence passed between them as the city lights began slowly to appear across Manhattan with the approaching evening. Finally, Amara spoke again, with steady clarity. "I will consider the proposal," she said, "but if we move forward it must remain honest about what it is and what it is not." Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the condition, while the skyline beyond them glowed brighter with each passing minute. And somewhere within the quiet balance of logic and sincerity, a decision had begun forming that would soon intertwine their lives in ways neither of them could fully predict. The evening sky over Manhattan deepened into shades of violet and gold, while the lights of the city began to shimmer across the horizon like scattered constellations. And inside the quiet office high above Central Park, Amara Bennett remained seated across from Ethan Blackwood, as the weight of his proposal settled into the space between them. The conversation had begun with corporate strategy, yet now it stood at the intersection of two lives that had previously followed completely separate paths. Amara rested her hands calmly together while studying the man before her, a billionaire whose decisions shaped industries, yet whose expression remained composed rather than persuasive. Ethan had not attempted to pressure her or decorate the proposal with empty promises. Instead, he had explained the circumstances with the same calm precision he used in financial negotiations, and that honesty carried a seriousness she respected. After several moments, she finally spoke again, her voice thoughtful rather than uncertain. "If this arrangement moves forward, it must remain respectful to both of our worlds," she said gently. "I will not allow the learning center to become a public relations symbol for something it is not." Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the concern. "The center will remain independent," he replied. "The partnership agreement guarantees operational autonomy. The only connection between our personal arrangement and the program will be the stability it allows both of us to maintain." Amara looked toward the city lights for a moment, considering the possibility that the decision before her could secure the future of hundreds of children who relied on the center each week. Yet she also understood that entering a contractual marriage, even one based on honesty, would reshape her personal life in ways she could not fully predict. She turned back toward Ethan and met his gaze with quiet clarity. "Then there must also be boundaries," she continued. "We will present the partnership publicly when necessary, but our private lives remain separate and honest about what this arrangement truly is." Ethan listened carefully before answering. "Boundaries are expected," he said. "The agreement will define them clearly. 2 years in duration with the option to conclude earlier if either of us determines the arrangement no longer serves its purpose." The calm practicality of the explanation reflected the disciplined logic that had built his reputation, yet beneath that logic Amara sensed something else, a quiet respect for her independence that had not been present in many negotiations she had witnessed over the years while seeking funding for the learning center. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the terms, though the decision itself had not yet fully formed. "I will need time to consider it," she said. Ethan accepted the answer without hesitation because patience had always been a strategic advantage in his world. "Of course," he replied. "Take whatever time you require." The meeting ended with the same composed professionalism with which it had begun, and Ethan escorted her to the reception area outside his office, where the evening lights of Manhattan now stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls. As the elevator doors closed, Amara felt the quiet gravity of the moment follow her downward through the tower, the idea of a contractual marriage still echoing through her thoughts while the city waited below with its familiar noise and motion. That night she returned to the learning center long after the students had gone home. Walking slowly through the quiet classrooms where colorful drawings and reading charts covered the walls like small promises of future possibilities, she paused beside one desk where a stack of notebooks waited for the next tutoring session and imagined how the new funding could expand the program, how additional teachers could reach children who still struggled with reading, how the center might grow into something stronger than she had ever dared to expect. The decision she faced was not simply about her own life, but about the opportunities that could unfold for the students who trusted her guidance each day. Across the city, Ethan Blackwood stood alone beside the glass wall of his penthouse office, looking down at the glowing grid of Manhattan streets, while Marcus Reed reviewed legal documents nearby. The proposal had been delivered with careful honesty, and now the outcome rested entirely in Amara Bennett's hands. Marcus closed the folder thoughtfully before speaking. "You rarely introduce uncertainty into your own strategy," he observed quietly. Ethan looked out across the city lights before answering in the calm tone that defined him. "Sometimes uncertainty reveals possibilities that strategy alone cannot create." Somewhere between those two reflections, the next chapter of their unlikely partnership had already begun forming. Not through calculation alone, but through the quiet alignment of purpose that neither of them had expected when their paths first crossed high above the streets of Manhattan. The following morning arrived quietly over Manhattan as pale winter sunlight slipped between the towers of glass and steel, and inside the Harlem Learning Center, Amara Bennett stood beside the large classroom window, watching children arrive one by one with backpacks bouncing lightly against their shoulders. The building filled with familiar sounds of greeting voices and laughter as volunteers prepared reading materials for the afternoon tutoring sessions. Yet behind Amara's calm expression her thoughts continued to circle the conversation she had shared with Ethan Blackwood the night before. The proposal he offered had not been dramatic or emotional, but it carried a gravity that could reshape the future of the Learning Center and her own life at the same time. She moved through the classroom greeting each student with steady warmth, helping a young girl organize her reading notebook and congratulating another boy for finishing his first chapter book, small moments of progress that reminded her why the center existed in the first place. When the morning session ended, she stepped into the small office at the back of the building where a stack of administrative papers waited beside the laptop on her desk. And for a moment, she sat quietly listening to the soft hum of the heater while sunlight filtered through the window. The decision before her was not simply about a contract or a public narrative, but about trust, responsibility, and the example she set for the young people who watched her every day. If she agreed to the arrangement with Ethan Blackwood, she would enter a world of corporate visibility and constant public attention, a world far removed from the modest classrooms where she spent most of her days. Yet the stability promised by the partnership could ensure that the Learning Center continued serving its students long after the uncertainty of small nonprofit funding had faded. Across the city, in the upper floors of Blackwood Global, Ethan stood near the wide glass wall of his office reviewing the latest market reports while the skyline stretched endlessly beyond Central Park, but his attention drifted again toward the conversation with Amara Bennett and the quiet certainty she carried when speaking about purpose and responsibility. Marcus Reed entered with a folder containing updated legal drafts for the proposed marriage arrangement, though he placed it on the desk without comment because Ethan had already explained that the next step depended entirely on Amara's decision. Ethan closed the tablet he had been reviewing and rested his hands on the desk in thoughtful silence before finally speaking. She will decide based on principle, Marcus said calmly. Not pressure. Marcus nodded because he had reached the same conclusion after observing the conversation the previous evening. Later that afternoon, Amara stepped outside the Learning Center and walked slowly through the neighborhood streets where winter sunlight reflected off the windows of small shops and cafes. The city moving around her with its usual rhythm of buses and conversations and distant music drifting from open doorways. She stopped for a moment at a small park where several children from the center often played after tutoring sessions, watching the empty swings move slightly in the cold breeze while considering the path that had brought her to this moment. The proposal from Ethan Blackwood had been structured with honesty rather than persuasion, and that honesty mattered more to her than any promise of financial support. She understood that the arrangement would be temporary and carefully defined, yet it would still require trust between two people who had known each other only briefly. As evening approached, she returned to the Learning Center and sat at her desk, where the outreach partnership documents rested beside her notebook. After several minutes, she reached for her phone and dialed the number Daniel Foster had given her earlier in the week. When the call connected, she spoke calmly, asking if Mr. Blackwood would be available the following morning because she had reached a decision regarding the proposal. The message was delivered to Ethan's office within minutes, and as he listened, Marcus observed the faintest shift in his expression, not excitement, but the focused calm that appeared whenever an important negotiation approached its final moment. Outside the windows, the lights of Manhattan began to glow once again across the skyline, and somewhere between the quiet classrooms of Harlem and the glass towers of corporate power, two very different worlds were preparing to meet in a single decision that would define the next chapter of both their lives. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Manhattan as sunlight spilled across the towering skyline and reflected from the glass walls of Blackwood Global headquarters. And inside the executive office, Ethan Blackwood stood beside the window, watching the city awaken beneath him while the faint glow of traffic lights faded in the growing daylight. The message from Amara Bennett the previous evening had been brief but decisive, and now the moment for her answer had arrived. Marcus Reed sat quietly at the conference table reviewing a prepared legal document, but he did not interrupt the silence because he understood that some decisions required space before they required conversation. Precisely at 9 o'clock, the assistant at the reception desk guided Amara Bennett through the tall doors of the office once again, and the calm rhythm of her footsteps crossed the polished floor as she approached the desk, where Ethan waited. Outside the windows, Central Park stretched wide beneath the winter sky, while the city hummed with the energy of another workday beginning. Ethan greeted her with the same composed respect he had shown during their earlier meetings and offered a seat across from him, while Marcus closed the legal folder and stepped quietly toward the far side of the room to allow them privacy. For a moment, neither of them spoke because the meaning of the conversation ahead required no dramatic introduction. Finally, Amara rested her hands gently together and met Ethan's gaze with calm certainty. "I have considered your proposal carefully," she said, "and I understand the responsibility it carries for both of us." Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and attentive. Amara continued speaking with quiet clarity, explaining that the future of the Learning Center had always depended on choices guided by integrity rather than convenience, and that any partnership she accepted must remain honest about its purpose while protecting the independence of the community work she had built. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the principle, because it reflected the same discipline he applied to every decision within his own world. After a brief pause, Amara spoke the words that would reshape the path ahead. "I will agree to the arrangement," she said, "but only under the conditions we discussed: transparency, independence, and respect for the lives we have each built." Ethan allowed a small breath to leave his chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition that the decision carried the same seriousness he had anticipated. "Those conditions are already written into the agreement," he replied calmly, "and they will remain unchanged." Marcus stepped forward, then placing the document on the desk, where both could see the final structure of the partnership. A 2-year marriage recognized publicly but defined privately by clear boundaries and mutual purpose. Amara studied the pages for several moments before signing her name beside Ethan's. The movement simple, yet symbolic of an agreement that neither of them had imagined only weeks earlier. When the papers were complete, Marcus quietly gathered the document and left the office to finalize the legal record while Ethan walked with Amara toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Manhattan stretched endlessly before them, alive with motion and possibility, and for a moment they stood side by side, without speaking. Finally, Ethan looked toward her and said with thoughtful sincerity that surprised even himself, "You understand that this arrangement was never meant to involve emotion." Amara smiled gently at the statement because she recognized the careful distance behind it. "I understand," she replied, "but life often moves in ways that contracts cannot predict." Ethan considered the words quietly while the morning light brightened across the skyline. Somewhere deep within the disciplined structure of his carefully controlled life, he sensed the truth in her observation, though he did not yet fully understand it. Far below, the city continued its restless rhythm of movement and ambition. Yet high above the streets, two people from very different worlds had just begun a partnership that would challenge everything Ethan Blackwood believed about certainty, independence, and the promise he once made to himself that love would never again enter his life.